Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your first flip of your next unit, right? Speaking of our next unit and stuff like that, we also got to talk about our last unit real fast. Big thing, I want to go ahead and give a shout out to all the kids that did super, super well on their tests. I'm going to be writing your names up there and stuff like that on my board so you know that you got A's and so you can know how impressed I am of you and your skills and all of y'all's genius attributes, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is that this is a little bit of a weird situation because you're currently watching this flip not at your house, right? Ew. You're watching it in class right now. You're probably sitting in your desk right now with all your little pens out and stuff like that, Emma Alvarado, and you're just ready to go. You're just such a good kid and stuff, and you're just like making sure that you're ready. And then you're like have earphones in, and then you're just looking around. I expect all of you to start looking around the classroom at each other right now. Try not to laugh too hard in front of the sub, whoever it is. If it's Mr. Mathern, Mr. Madrano, or Mr. Wooderson, tell them I said, hey, and that I miss those guys, all right? Three very, very good dudes out there, right? So the big thing about it, though, in general, is you're going to need to watch this, and this flip is the only thing that you're responsible for doing going into, like, Labor Day, right? Now, some of you are, like, F period right now. It's like, wait a minute, Labor Day? It's after Labor Day. All right, like, well, calm down, F period, all right? Y'all are in a little bit of a weird situation, right? Because I didn't see y'all after, like, before, y'all are in a little bit of a weird situation because y'all are, this is hard to explain. Like, everybody needs to have this flip that was posted to their Google Classroom that you're watching currently done by the time you come back to class after Labor Day weekend, right? You got it? Got it? Perfect. And I'll include that in the Google Classroom description as well, but you just need to focus on doing this really, really well. So the big thing about it, though, is we are going to kind of jump here in about 2 seconds because B and C period already talked about some of this stuff, right? So let's go ahead and jump to B and C period where they left off in class. Exactly. So now, however, this is your F period flip, right? F period is in a little bit of a different situation because F period took their stuff and then they're starting the new unit today in class, right? So let's go ahead and get into it, F period. So the big thing about it, though, is we left off in our last unit talking about classical era Greece, right? We're talking about classical Greece. We're talking about the Greek philosophers and things like that. But getting into it so we better understand everything, y'all have to understand that when we're talking about classical Greece, a lot of people refer to this time period as like a golden age, right? So the thing about it is classical Greece is referred to this because it was a time period where art and economies and cultures were all at their peak. Now, it's a very important thing to understand, though, real quick, and maybe we should jot this down real fast. For which city-state, though? For who? Who was this such a big thing for? And that is exactly right, Caden Dempster. I heard you back there. I know I've said your name like 1,000 times in flips. I should probably say somebody else, too. I heard a bunch of people yelling out stuff in F period, right? F period always has such good participation. F period stands for fantastic, right? The big thing about it, though, is like, Shea Victory, I heard you over there, right? Athens was having a golden age, right? Athens was having a really, really giant leap forward, and they were making tons of money, and they were making tons of art, and they had Pericles rebuilding the Parthenon, and they had Pericles making a statue of Athena out of ivory and gold, and they had all the philosophers. But Athens is expanding and checking all these boxes, but this is infuriating one other group of people. Because who wasn't involved in that classical period? Who didn't get to participate in that? Who wasn't allowed in this fancy schmancy Delian league that was made by the Athenians? Who wasn't having art and expansion because they got hit by an earthquake and had a Helot rebellion? Oh yeah, that's right, Sparta, right? Sparta is getting so furious with the cultural expansion of Athens, right? Because you know what? This is how it feels.
This is Sparta!
I know, right? So that's a big thing. I'm going to use that clip 1,000 times. You just drop it randomly in flips out of nowhere and stuff like that. So you can see King Leonidas kick a Persian messenger into a well. Now, so the big thing about it, though, is Sparta is becoming infuriated because Athens is growing their power and growing their economic standing and pushing a lot of boundaries and things like that, right? So the big thing, as you can see right here as well, Athens has expanded throughout this entirety of the Aegean Sea. All this stuff in yellow is like areas that Athens is allied with. It's members of the Delian League. It's colonies that they have created. So Athens is getting really, really big, and especially being able to use that really large naval fleet that they have, replete with all those trireme vessels, to expand over all this stuff, right? This is a really big deal and a big concept that we need to understand because it's going to lead to a giant conflict, right? And some of you are like, ooh, different Prezi, new colors, right? Maybe you want to change up the color in your notes, right? Because we're moving into the end of the classical period / the Hellenistic period, right? That last little time period that we had to break off and talk about in our next unit, right? So the big thing about it, though, getting into it is we're now getting into the Peloponnesian War, right? The Peloponnesian War is going to be a massive thing where Sparta and Athens are going to go head-to-head for 27 really long years. And it depresses me so much and makes me feel like this. When I remember that when I first made this Prezi, I was 26, so I was still younger than the Peloponnesian War, but now I'm old and crusty and older than the Peloponnesian War. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is this massive 27-year-long war that broke out between Athens and Sparta. A lot of it caused over the resentment of the growth of Athens during their actual classical period, right? Athens is gobbling up new states. They're bringing in member states. They're creating this Delian League, and they're expanding over all this territory, right? But the big thing about it as well is that, remember, when we talk about Athens, we're talking about this group called the Delian League, right? Which is Athens and its allies, and it has a massive navy, okay? Now, the big thing about it, though, is also, when you're talking about the Delian League in Athens, and a lot of y'all, like, I feel like Sparta would just, like, smack and, like knock, like, Athens completely out of this entire war so quickly because they are all about war and stuff like that. But remember, Athens fights wars differently than Sparta does. Sparta has much more of a land army, and they actually are the ones that are going to like square off with the Persians at the Battle of Thermopylae, while the Athenians are in their trireme vessels, and they're fighting the Persians at like the Strait of Salamis in the water, right? So there's an interesting little dynamic that's going to pop up here, because the Delian League, which is Team Athens, and then there's this other team called the Peloponnesian League, which is Sparta and its allies, right? Looking at the entire construction of this war, they're due for having a very long war that's going to take forever, because one of them is very good on land and the other one is very good in the water, right? And then also, on top of everything else, ironically enough, Sparta's being kind of a hypocrite because the Peloponnesian League is actually much older than the Delian League ever was, and Sparta actually took over these other different territories and then also allied with other places like Corinth or Megara or like one of those other two, and like all these other city-states, and kind of brought them under their rule as well. So Team Peloponnesian / Sparta is going to go head-to-head with Team Delian / Athens, and it's going to last 27 years. And they end up in what's known as a stalemate, right? Sparta tries to blockade Athens and starve them out. Athens then tries to blockade Sparta and starve them out. They have minor, like, little, like, actual meetings and stuff like that, big battles that happen on the land occasionally. But Sparta is going to win those. And then Sparta doesn't have boats to fight Athens out in the water and stuff like that. So the big thing that you need to understand about a stalemate is what it is. Go ahead and jot this word down, because it's going to be very, very important, especially when we learn about World War I later on in the year, right? A stalemate is super important. Jot this down. Are you jotting this down? Are you ready to jot this down? It's very important that you jot this down, okay? Like, jot this down and then circle it and underline it. And if it's not highlighted and in your notes, then I know you weren't actually, like, paying attention and you actually muted my flip, which is disgusting and it hurts my feelings. Now, like, so, like, getting into it, though, a stalemate is a deadlock between two sides, right? That's what a stalemate is. Like, you know when you play, like, tic-tac-toe and, like, you get into, like, where it's like, oh, no one's winning? That's a stalemate, right? A stalemate is when two sides are constantly fighting against each other in a war and no one is being a clear-cut winner. That's why this war lasted 27 years, because Athens would have a victory and then Sparta would have a victory and then they just kept like hitting each other and like nobody was winning, right? And the stalemate would not be broken until 27 years later, when Sparta is going to do one of the grimiest things ever, and they're going to borrow Persia's naval fleet? I know, Sparta sided with Persia and stuff like that after having massive wars with them and after the Battle of Thermopylae and stuff like that. Well, remember, though, Darius was really upset, and Persians didn't really like Athenians, so they were probably willing to work with the Spartans anyway. There's also this vicious rumor that was going around Greece that the only reason the second Persian invasion even ended is because Sparta actually, like, did deals with them and stuff like that and actually, like, made an agreement to, like, stop attacking one another, right? So the thing about it is, though, is that this conflict, regardless of what Sparta did, regardless of if they borrowed Persia's naval fleet, regardless of this treachery is not one of the worst that any Greek or Greco-Roman civilization's ever seen, the conflict is going to leave southern Greece in rubble, right? It's going to leave southern Greece in a very, very, like, crusty, very, very messed up situation, right? Because buildings were destroyed, cities were destroyed, entire populations died. And the other interesting thing, though, is that Sparta, since they won, they're now ruling over all of southern Greece, right? It's called Spartan hegemony. Like, so, what, like, hegemonomnon. There's this one history word that I can never say, and it's like hegemony.
You go about pronouncing it? Hegemony.
Yeah, that word, right? I can never say that word. Like, so, like, it literally means, like, rulership or an era of rulership. And when Sparta did this, they, of course, were not concerned about intercoastal trade and stuff like that, and it made actually, like, the, like, other city-states really, really weak, right? And so since it left them in rubble, you have to understand that we're now moving into, though, a very, very interesting time period. So we're still in the classical period. We had not ended the classical period yet. The Peloponnesian War is going to kind of mark the dying of the classical period, and another one is going to happen immediately after that. But now we have to shift gears a little bit, okay? So we're shifting gears a little bit. Just know that the Peloponnesian War was happening in the background. And now we're moving over into what these people are known as the Macedonians, right? So Macedonia is a very, very important place, right? Like, so Macedonia, you have to really, really understand, and you need to make sure you know who the Macedonians are going into this entire next unit. And also, you'll notice as well, there's a map posted onto your, there's a map posted onto your Google Classroom, and y'all have your first map quiz coming back from the entirety of, like, your Labor Day weekend. Ha 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 ha. Take that, nerds. All right, so, like, yeah, you have a map quiz coming back from your, like, entire, like, thing, so make sure you pay attention to that, and you're going to need to know where Macedonia is on it. But Macedonia is this northern part above Greece, okay? And so, like, if you're looking at it on this map right here, this is Greece, that's Bulgaria, that's Albania, that's Kosovo, Montenegro, that's Serbia, looks like a dog in its hind legs, that's Albania, that's Romania. Yes, Mr. Terry knows all the countries. Now, like, the big thing about it, though, is Macedonia is right there, all right? So it's this little northern sector at the very, very top. And at the time, it was, like, uncivilized, wild frontier. When Athens was building Parthenons and Sparta's kicking butt at Thermopylae, well, you know what I mean. You know how the story goes. Like, so, like, while all this stuff is going on, Macedonia was like a mountainous terrain that had a large population of people that lived there, but it wasn't, like, civilized like the other Greeks were, right? It wasn't, like, super, super intense and learned and all this other stuff, but they were just kind of out there, spread out and sparsed out amongst the entire area, until a man comes along that decides he wants to unite all the Macedonians together and create one of the biggest armies that Greece has ever seen, right? Now, this is an interesting choice in timing and stuff like that, but it's very important to know who the most famous Macedonian king is. And the most famous Macedonian king is this guy by the name of Philip II. Philip II is a very important ruler because he's going to show up and he's going to collectively mush all of the Macedonians together, right? He's going to collectively bring them all together and he's going to make it so that Macedonia is going to be a reputable power, right? As we've been talking about with archaic Greece and classical Greece, it's always Athens and Sparta, Athens and Sparta, Athens and Sparta. Well, now we have a new group that's going to pop up that's going to be very, very powerful. And during the Peloponnesian War, they weren't involved. They were sitting in the background, getting their army together and stuff like that, preparing to be able to take over all of southern Greece. And the guy who is going to collect them together is the man by the name of Philip II, right? And Philip II is going to be the ruler of Macedonia, and he's going to be a fantastic ruler at that. And this right here is a bust of Philip II. And you'll notice really quick, looking at this bust, there seems to be something wrong with his face, all right? Yeah, there is something wrong with his face, all right? Well, the reason why there's something wrong with his face is because literally he got shot in this eye with an arrow during a battle, right? Legit, the dude looked up into the air and the arrow went, shoo, and like just went straight into his eyeball and stuff like that, and like literally went into his skull, came out the back, right? And they had to clip the back of the arrow off and then pull the actual shaft of the arrow out, and his eye was forever damaged, and they had to remove it, right? So they stitched it up and stuff like that, and he literally was missing an eye in one of his sockets. And it's really, really funny to me, because what if they had to like pull the arrow out and then the eyeball came out with it? It was like, and then he's just like, look, it's a GoPro. And he's just like looking at stuff with it. But the big thing about it in general, though, is he got shot in the eye with an arrow. And there's a crazy myth as to why this happened, right? And apparently, according to the myth, it's because he saw something he wasn't supposed to see, right? Like, so we'll talk about that in class and stuff like that when you get back. Do me a favor and be like, hey, Mr. Terry, what did Philip II of Macedon see that he wasn't supposed to see, apparently? We'll discuss, all right? So now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is that you also need to understand that the king of Macedonia, Philip II, is going to be collectivizing all these people together while Athens and Sparta are having this big war, right? While they're having a war, he's getting a really, really strong army together. And he also has not one, not two, not three, but 7 different wives, right, that have, like, throughout his entire existence, so he has a lot of kids, right? So, like, the big thing about Philip II's kids, though, is he has one very, very famous child, right? And his famous child is going to be known as Alexander III, right? So the thing about it, though, is let's go ahead and backtrack a little bit, all right? So Philip decides to conquer Greece following the Peloponnesian War. Why would Philip do this? Let's think about that, shall we? This is a very important thing you need to write down. It is not on the notes. It is not on this Prezi. It does not exist in front of your face right now. But why would Philip II decide to conquer Greece and take over Athens and Sparta and Corinth and Megara and all those other little city-states after this Peloponnesian War? Why would he do this? Well, he would decide to do this for one big, giant, particular reason. all right? It has to do with the fact that, one, his army is huge, and then also because Athens and Sparta are now very weak because they just fought a 27-year-long war against each other, y'all. Like, they just, were fighting one another in such a vicious, traumatic, climactic way that literally it was going to be the best opportunity for him. And Philip also refined the phalanx system, and he literally, created longer spears and more, crammed together, like Philip the Second phalanx, all right? Literally, he actually took the idea of the phalanx that the Spartans and the Athenians used, and he made it even bigger, right? So he made it even larger and gave longer spears to the guys in the back, and he made it even more of a formidable force, and he refined the use of this system, so literally his army was going to be unstoppable. So of course he would choose to do this after the Peloponnesian War, this 27-year-long war that destroyed most of southern Greece, because he feels as though he's just going to kind of walk in there and be like, oh, hello, I'm here to take this over, right? So now he does this with his young son at his side the entire time, right? And his son's name is Alexander, right? And Alexander, in the long run, is much more famous than his father, right? So Alexander even had a famous tutor because Philip saw potential in him. Philip saw this massive amount of potential in this child. And so when he was 13 years old, Philip decided, not when Philip's 13, but when Alexander's 13 years old, Philip decides to hire the best and smartest tutor that anyone has seen in all of ancient Greece. And that is a man by the name of Aristotle, right? So he hires Aristotle to be his son's tutor. And he decides what he's going to do is actually allow Alexander to become just as intelligent as Aristotle because he wants to take how tenacious Alexander's personality is and he wants to marry it with being smart, right? And there was all these really, really intense stories about Alexander's that demonstrated his genius and stuff like that at a young age. And this is one of the most famous ones, right? It's the taming of his horse, Bucephalus, right? Go ahead and say that to yourself. Bucephalus, all right? So yeah, Bucephalus. It literally means ox head, which is actually really, really interesting. And a lot of it has to do with this big, big white mark that the horse had on his chest because literally it had horns on it and stuff like that, and it looks like an ox head. So that's what Alexander named him. But when Philip was actually with Alexander, this story kind of tells us that Alexander, even from a very young age, showed that he was going to just take over the entire world, right? And it has to do with the fact that Bucephalus apparently was a massive black stallion, a huge horse that was very, very expensive, but apparently unrideable, right? And untamable. And one day, when actually Philip II was actually taking over some different stuff, Alexander sees this horse that has killed multiple people that have tried to ride it when they're trying to break him, right? And Alexander looks at his dad and he says, "Dad, buy that horse." And Philip looks at his son, Alexander, and says, "Son, no, he might kill you. No one can ride this horse." And Alexander says, "I'll make you a bet, Dad. You buy that horse, I'll tame him right now." A 13-year-old child is saying this, and this horse has killed grown men, right? And so he says, fine, do it. He buys the horse, and Alexander walks up to the horse, right? And Bucephalus gets up on his feet, and he's kicking and stuff like that. He's freaking out, and he throws a hoof forward, and Alexander dodges it. It almost kills Alexander in that moment, right? And Bucephalus comes down, and Alexander grabs him by the mare, right? Grabs him by his hair and pulls him in close and whispers in his ear and calms Bucephalus down. And then he takes, Bucephalus, and he turns him into the sun because Alexander from the crowd realized something. Bucephalus wasn't angry, he was afraid, right? He was scared of his own shadow because he is a giant black horse and he kept seeing this other giant black horse on the ground, so he was afraid. And Alexander realized that, came up to him, calmly whispered in his ear, hopped onto Bucephalus' back, and rode him away into the distance, right? That is a moment where Philip II's like, I got to get this kid a good teacher, right? And then he hires Aristotle, right? And then literally, Bucephalus would later on go on to be Alexander's best friend. It's the cutest thing I've ever heard. It's like Pierre and me, man. I can't ride Pierre, though. He's really tiny. Now, so the big thing about it, though, in general, though, is why does he do this? All this stuff is really important. Why are we talking about it? Because it demonstrates Alexander's authority, and it shows us that Philip's no dum-dum, and he's going to go and attack, all of, the entirety of Greece after the Peloponnesian War, right? Now, Philip, though, is going to use a variety of tactics to actually pull this whole thing off, right? Some of the most famous ones include diplomacy, right? Some of the smaller northern Greek states are just kind of really can't defend themselves like Sparta and Athens can. So Philip tells them, look, if you join my empire, you get to be added to my military, and we're going to be able to be one of the strongest forces you've ever seen, and I'll protect you. And so he actually takes over a bunch of places without even having to have a fight, right? He also threatens a bunch of places and says, look, if you don't actually come in to my empire, then I'm going to come in and destroy you because my military is huge and I have this giant phalanx and all of you are dead from fighting a 27-year-long war, right? He also bribes people in larger city-states, gives a bunch of leaders money, creates some different allies. But the big question about it is Sparta. Sparta, as we know, is the most warrior-like culture that has ever existed in the entirety of Greek history, right? And you would think that Philip II, when he rolls up to Sparta, would be like, all right, we can fight, or you can, and then Sparta would be like, fight, we want to fight you, we'll kill you in a minute, whatever. And they're over there drinking blood soup, being like, I'm going to destroy you. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is this is apparently the story that happened. Sparta, this little green dot down here towards this area, is the only place that Philip never took over. Philip II never took over Sparta because of one particular funny little reason. It's mostly due to the fact that Philip threatened Sparta, and Philip was like, hey, Sparta, big fellas. All right, you can submit and surrender to me, but if I bring my army into Laconia, and if I show up in your valley, we will have a war, and I will try to take you over. Sparta received this note, looked at it, and then sent him a note back. And the only thing that note said on it was, if. And underlined 6 times. If you show up here, you're stupid, right? And so Philip looked at the note and was like, you know what, we'll just leave those guys alone. And he never went after Sparta, which I find to be very, very funny, right? So the big thing about it in general, though, is with his brilliant son at his side, Philip takes over the entirety of ancient Greece, right? Except for Sparta. And literally takes over the rest of the Delian League, and Athens doesn't even fight Philip II. They surrender out of fear. And as you can tell, Alexander is growing into a dominant, very smart, and intelligent young man. And look at that flow, man. Look at that lettuce on that guy's hair. It looks like he invented that white boy hair flip, you know what I'm talking about? That one where they go, and then just get it out of their face or whatever when they're sitting down. It's so annoying. So we'll talk about that a little bit in class as well, and how unfortunately there was a point in Mr. Terry's life where he did that as well. But we won't talk about that right now because it's embarrassing, right? So the big thing about it, though, in general, though, is with his brilliant son Alexander at his side at the young age of 18, Philip conquered the entire Delian League and took over all of Greece because they were together and they were like, Dad, proud of you, bro. Nice. And so going forward, though, you have to understand also that Philip then sets his sights on the one place that tried to take over Greece multiple times, and he was like, if I can take over that place, I'm basically taking over the world, right? And Philip II with his son is like, my son and I will strike out and we will take over Persia, right? We will take over Persia, which was a gigantic empire that the world had never seen one larger than it. Persian Empire. Literally, Philip looks at this map and says, you know what? I'm going to take over all of that, right? You got little teeny tiny little Greece over here, right? Greece is over here, just this little area right there. And there's Macedon, where Philip and Alexander are from. They just took over that, and then they want to go out and they want to they take over all of that, right? Which is going to be a very, very, very intense thing. But Philip II feels that he can do this because he has his son Alexander at his side, and he's like, we got this. There's no one who can stop us, right? No one can stop my phalanxes. No one can stop my army, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger. Let's go out. Let's kick some Persian butt, right? But unfortunately, what happened is Philip II couldn't take Alexander to go take over Persia because he was stabbed to death at his daughter's funeral by one of his bodyguards, actually, right? Philip II got stabbed to death at the day of his daughter's funeral by one of the closest people to him. There's an entire thing that we'll talk about, the big reason why. If you want to know why Philip's bodyguard stabbed him or whatever, just ask him during the war and be like, excuse me, Mr. Terry, I have a question. Why did Philip's bodyguard stab him? What was the point? And I'll tell you the whole story behind it and stuff like that in general. It actually kind of reads a lot like a really, really goofy horror story and stuff like that. But after this occurs, who is then now going to be slated to take over? His son Alexander, right? Following the death of his father, Alexander is at the age of 18, right? And he becomes the new king of Macedonia. And Macedonia does not control just Macedonia anymore. It controls Athens and Thebes and Corinth and Megara and the entirety of the Greek peninsula and all of its islands, right? Alexander is then going to go on to become Alexander the Great, right? Now, how do you become great? What do you do to become great? What is it that you're getting after that's making you great, right? Well, the big thing about it is Alexander strikes out when he turns 20. It takes 2 years, about a year and a half, actually, from when he turns 18, or from when his father died when he was 18, until he's 20. And he collects the biggest military that's ever been seen. And he's like, I'm going to pick up where my dad left off, and I'm going to take over the known world, right? And so he decides that he wants to conquer Persia with his gigantic military. And he's like, you know what? Come at me, bro. I will destroy you in a heartbeat, right? So, Alexander wants to take it over, and the current leader of Persia at this time is a man by the name of Darius III, right? Not Darius the First, not the Darius that was really upset, actually a descendant of Darius the First. This is Darius III, right? Darius III is the ruler of Persia, and Persia actually has been getting a little bit weaker as time goes on, so Alexander shows up at the perfect time. And Alexander even told him, Alexander told Darius, he said, Darius, if you surrender, now you will save millions of lives. You will save millions of your soldiers, you will save millions of dollars, right? Like, so you will not have to spend all this money if you submit to me now, right? But remember, Greece is small and Persia's huge, right? Like, so, like, Darius laughs at the young Alexander and says, ha, 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 ha. Yeah, right. Like, you're going to come in and take over this gigantic essence of, like, an entire area. Literally, Darius III then shows up to fight Alexander. Like, shows up at the, like, big battle that Alexander and Darius have against each other very first. And, like, literally, he is just, like, laughing in the background. He's like, ha, 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 there's no way this young buck is going to do anything. Darius was so confident, actually, that he could destroy Alexander's army that he even brought his wife and kids with him. Like, he literally actually brought his wife. He was like, watch me take over the Greek boy with the long hair that, like, flings it around from side to side. Like, so he decides that he's just like, I'm just going to take him over. It's not going to be a big deal. I'm not afraid of him. What's up? Come at me, bro. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is you have to understand is that Alexander wasn't doing what Darius was. So Darius, in this battle, it was very, very common for leaders to sit in the back, right? They sat in the background and they watched the battle happen. And then they had to retreat. They had to retreat, or if they won, they would, like, come in, and they would come down after the victory, right? Darius the third, though, looked on in horror as his force was routed by Alexander. And Alexander fought in the battle with his soldiers, right? Now, this is a really important concept about Alexander's personality, right? Alexander the Great's personality, he fought with his men, right? He literally was on a horse in the cavalry unit, fully armored, with a sword, and that horse's name, of course, we know, sitting right here, is Bucephalus, right? That huge horse, he would ride into battle every single time, and he was not afraid of anyone, and he was not afraid to almost die with his comrades, right? He was not the leader that told you what to do so you went and got stabbed. He's the leader that was standing next to you, fighting along with you, right? Darius III looks on this in horror as he gets embarrassed by this young buck's, like, military, and he runs off, right? He starts bouncing around different cities, running away with all of his, like, kids and stuff. Literally, like, look at all the places. Like, he goes, like, fight. This is where that first battle has. And this is literally Darius running away. Like, over a series of years, he's like, and he just, like, keeps running off, right? And literally, Alexander won battle after battle after battle after battle, chasing Darius down. In a total of over 300 battles, right? It's wild. And, like, literally at some of them, Alexander almost lost, but he never actually lost any of them. Came very, very close, especially one time when he was actually in Egypt. Persia had taken over Egypt, and the big thing about it was Darius ran away to Persia for one particular reason. Or not Persia, to Egypt for one particular reason. Because Egypt is in the middle of a giant desert, right? It's the Sahara, okay? Like, it's in the middle of the Sahara, and if you have an army out there, you have to keep them hydrated, and they have to drink water, and the human body can only last, like, 3 days without water. And the story goes that Darius was like, look, I'll run away into the desert, into Memphis, into Egypt, and there's no way he'll be able to get me there. He's got his wife and kids with him and stuff like that. He's like, it's okay, I got it. There's no way. All of them are going to, like starve and die of dehydration out there before they can get to me. It's whatever. So Alexander was out in the desert with his men, and his men were dying of thirst, right? And Alexander was dying of thirst as well. But his men, because they respected Alexander so much, refused to let their captain die, and they went from soldier to soldier to soldier, collecting water in a helmet, right? They literally, like, took all their canteens and they were like, pour it out for Alexander. He has to live. Give it to Alexander, our leader. Give it to Alexander. He must live to carry on the campaign, right? And they brought this helmet full of water up to Alexander, and he looked upon it, and they were like, sir, drink. Drink this water, because we are dying in this desert, chasing after this man Darius, and we want you to go on and take over Persia, because if you die, our cause dies with you. And Alexander took the helmet, and he poured it out onto the ground, and he threw it. And his men were horrified. They were like, why did you just do that, sir? And Alexander said to them, if you don't drink, I don't drink. His men were like, I'll die for you. And they just went in and took over all of Egypt, right? It's an absolutely wild thing because Alexander's military genius and leadership strategies are really, really intense, right? And he never lost a battle. Even one time when he came up against war elephants in India. But a really sad story about the war elephants is when he was in India and he was fighting against the elephants. Guess who died? Bucephalus died.
Oh, honey. Oh. And that was a new one.
I know. Well, so Bucephalus actually died in India, in northern India, protecting Alexander, we believe. We actually believe that he was riding Bucephalus into battle against one of these elephants, and in one of the actual battles that had the war elephants in them, we think that literally Bucephalus was wounded mortally and he died. Now, an interesting little thing about this whole story, too, about this map, is every single time that Alexander would take a place over, he would rename the city after himself. He'd be like, okay, this is Alexander Town, and this is Alexandria, and this is Alexandretta, and this is Alexandropolis, and this is Alexander House, and this is my house. Alexander. The only place that he didn't name after himself is this area of northern India where a city was founded, and he named it Bucephala after where Bucephalus died. Love that guy. Now. But the big thing about it, though, as well, is that Alexander is so famous, in fact, that he took over the entirety of the Persian Empire, and he killed Darius. Fun fact. He didn't kill him. There's a whole other story about it. But Darius does end up dying and gets crucified and stuff like that a little bit later on, which is a really, really interesting story that I'll tell you about in class. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is that you also have to understand that before setting out again, Alexander unexpectedly died from a sudden fever, right? He left the empire to 3 different generals, and then, literally what's going to happen is, when he's sitting on his deathbed and he's dying and he's just croaking out and stuff like that, he's just like, they're asking him, Sir, the empire, who do we leave it to? Who do we give it to? You are our leader. What were we going to do without you? And Alexander, reached out from his deathbed and he said, give it to the best. And then he just dies. And so his 3 strongest generals took the empire and split it up into different areas. But now, as we know, do men share power well? No. So over the next 300 years, the empire is going to fall apart through these men battling for absolute control of the entire empire, right? But what happens, though, is after Alexander dies, that is then the beginning of the Hellenistic period, right? So this is after the death of Alexander. When is it, y'all? There you go. After the death of Alexander, right? Very, very good job, guys. I heard you, okay? Now, it's a blend, though, of Greek, Persian, and Egyptian and Indian cultures, because those are all the areas that he took over, right? It's an area of cultural diffusion. Oh, man, quick jump, outfit change. Oh, my God, what's going on? We got back to school night coming up any second now, right? But really, really quick, F period. That is where your flip is going to end, right? So you can go ahead and log this off. You are done, and I will see y'all when I get back from Italy, all right? It was real. Look forward to seeing y'all soon.